Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first seminar of the cycle Literature and Beyond. I'm Valentina Modolo, organizer of this initiative, and I sent a greeting also on behalf of Marco Sartor, PhD student at the University of Parma, who provided the scientific advisory support. And this seminar has been organized within Bembus research project, Literature and Visual Art in the Renaissance, promoted by the Department of Humanities of Ca' Foscari and by the Center for Digital and Public Humanities of Ca' Foscari, whom I would like to express my thanks, and financed with the funds for students of Ca' Foscari. I would like to say a few words about Bembus Association. Bembus is an international community of young scholars whose aim is to investigate the knowledge production in the humanities, especially in relation to digitally driven transformations. And within Bembus, there are three different projects, three different research projects. The first one is transmediality and comparative studies. The second one is linguistic and web, authors, writings, and perspective. And the third one that I have already mentioned is literature and visual art in the Renaissance. Bembus is also the publisher of an international journal called Aldus, and regularly organizes symposia, seminars, and workshops and training in the field of the knowledge. And also, yes, for have more information about Bembus, I share in the chat the link of the website. So Filippo, if you can list it, it's perfect. And now I quickly introduce this cycle of seminars. So why have we chosen this name, Literature and Beyond? We have chosen this name, Literature and Beyond, because it is a cycle of 5 seminars, dedicated to some of the challenges that literature is called to face in 21st century through comparison with other area of humanistic knowledge. And in these seminars, we will discuss with other professors of different disciplines. For example, today, material culture, urban spaces, painting, arts, visual studies, ecology. And we will answer or try to answer questions such as what is the link between literature and material culture? Or how did the urban speciality condition literature expressions in the late Middle Ages? Or again, how do literature and art dialogue from the early modern age to contemporary times? And finally, how do literature text becomes a barrier of ecological concern? So how literature can transmit the problem of ecology. I want to say that this cycle of seminar is characterized by the seminal nature of the talks. So it is not a presentation of the state of the art in a specific field of knowledge, but it is first of all an open discussion that must lead us to reflect on some topics. And today, I'm very pleased to start this cycle of seminars with Anthony Enns, Associate Professor of Contemporary Culture in the Department of English at Dalhousie University in Canada, and Dr. Bernard Metz, co-leader of a Swiss National Science Foundation project at the Institute for the History of Medicine at the University of Bern in Switzerland, who will serve as speakers. Dr. Bernard Metz will also serve as the moderator of the discussion in the second part of this event. So thank you very much for being with us today. And I will now give the floor to Bernard Metz, who will introduce the speakers and the topic of this session. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Valentina. I have the honor of leading you through this afternoon and also of being part of this first seminary of the first cycle of Literature and Beyond. My name is Bernard Metz, and I'm working at the University of Bern. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you the speaker of this first event, Professor Anthony Enns, who is, as Valentina told us, Associate Professor of English and Contemporary Culture at Dalhousie University, Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. He's well known among scholars working on media and material culture. To make it clear, he isn't a professor not only of literature, this would not cover his tremendous knowledge of anything related to popular culture, including advertising, comics, design, music, the movies, science fiction, all parts of consumer culture, but officially his position is dedicated to contemporary culture, including popular culture and media as well. So his research interests cover far more than the regular English studies or English literature, but also optical and acoustic media, literature and the sciences, science fiction, film, typography, or the graphic novel. He did edit and co-edit so different books like Screening Disability, Essays on Cinema and Disability in 2001, or Sonic Mediations, Body Sound Technology in 2008, or also Vibratory Modernism on the Vibrations. But he has also co-edited special issues of several journals, among them Belfigur, on Distinctions That Matter, Popular Literature and Media Culture in 2015. And finally, this year, there will be Consumerism and Prestige, the Materiality of Literature in the Modern Age with Anthem Press. I will not name the impressive number of articles and papers Anthony did publish. You will find them listed on his website. But he's also, and this is very impressive for me, a successful translator of German media theory, including famous authors like Friedrich Kittler or Sibylle Kramer. So we did prepare something, so I could come back to my image if you like, which is more than a regular talk and different also from a normal book presentation. So you see we're in between and trying out different media, switching between speakers and between topics could help to get it more attractive and entertaining, we thought, even in this still not too satisfying virtual situation, sitting in front of a screen instead of being together in one place. And believe us, we would be happier to be in Venice right now and talk to you directly. The plan is that first Anthony will give an overview of about 15 minutes introducing you into the topic of literature and material culture concerning publishing practices and social distinctions of taste since the industrialization of printing. Second, I will give an overview of the two publications we edited together. The second one, well, has already not been published, to tell the truth, but it will finally come out in July, the printed book. Third, Anthony will give the example of a case study to better show in detail what it is all about touching the comic book, and the graphic novel. Finally, we will have at least 30 minutes of discussion to ask what's still open and to communicate among each other. This seminar series is called Literature and Beyond, and we both are very interested in the Italian situation and would be happy if you could help us to understand it better. It will be possible to use the chat function and to ask written questions or give written comments, but also to ask directly, I think, either in English or in Italian, if we manage to do this. This is only to make clear that we would be very happy to have a vivid discussion going on, because this topic is still so vast and interesting and there's still so much to discover. So please prepare, while we are talking, some questions that lead us further. But also keep in mind that we are interested in asking you as well. So don't be ungenerous with your critique and suggestions. The discussion is why this evening is most important for us. So let's get started. There's the first slide, I see it, with a more theoretic but also very entertaining, it does contain much stimulating pictorial material, first part. I'm very happy to have you here, Anthony, and I'm looking forward to your presentation on literature and material culture, publishing practices and distinctions of taste since the industrialization of printing.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And everyone can see the slides?
Yes, we can see.
Yes. Fantastic. So yes, so thank you for this wonderful invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Valentina and Marco and Filippo for helping to organize this event. And thanks to everyone who's coming. I'm sorry that we can't meet in person, but I am looking forward to the discussion and hearing about your own work, as Bernhard already said. And this first part of the presentation is just a general introduction to the topic of literature and material culture. So for many years, scholars in the field of book studies have focused on how publishing practices influence literary production. So for example, historians like William Charvat, Robert Darnton, famously urge scholars to examine how printers and publishers and booksellers have also molded the meanings of literary texts. And this foundational work has been expanded in more recent years to include a growing interest in the topic of literary prestige, as scholars have studied how the recognition of certain texts or writers as particularly significant often depends on systems of economic exchange. Now, I'll just give you a few examples. Joe Morgan argued that writers gain legitimacy from the notion of celebrity as supported by broad popularity and success in the marketplace. And James English, in his work on literary prizes, he also argued that literary prestige is woven together with and cannot be understood apart from the money economy. So while prestige and commercialism would seem to be opposing forces, they are actually often very interdependent because the circulation of cultural capital can't be entirely removed from the circulation of economic capital. And in more recent years, scholars have also studied how the material properties of literary texts also influence their meaning. So David Pearson famously claimed that understanding the history of books and of the communication of ideas through books needs to take into account the impact of their physical form. And much of this work has been inspired by the rise of ebooks, and a lot of scholars are focusing on works of experimental literature that use their material substrates in some sort of innovative way. So what Bernhard and I have been trying to do is to draw connections between these two recent trends by thinking about how the material aspects of literary texts also reflect and possibly even determine their cultural status. So following the industrialization of printing, for example, the use of cheaper materials allowed books to be produced in large quantities and marketed to a broad readership, which decreased printing costs and increased their profits. But mass-produced books were often perceived as disposable and therefore inconsequential. And the use of more expensive materials could serve to elevate a text's cultural status, but this would often limit the circulation of a text and reduce its profitability. So prestige was often seen as directly proportional to rarity and price. And in many cases, the distinction between highbrow and lowbrow books had little to do with their content. They more often functioned as markers of socioeconomic status, like clothing or home decor. And you could even go so far as to say that the concept of literary taste is really more closely related to fashion sense than critical judgment. The cultural status of literary texts can thus be understood as an inherent consequence of their material forms, which often change the value of texts that are otherwise experienced as more or less prestigious. So moving ahead on the slideshow, the materiality of literature became increasingly significant following the industrialization of printing, which began with the development of automatic paper-making machines and automatic printing presses, as well as innovations in bookbinding, like the development of stabbing machines, folding machines, rounders and backers, and various gilding, cutting, and trimming machines. The development of I should move ahead here to sewing. Yeah, a sewing machine for making books. Also, the development of mechanical hot lead typesetting machines, like the linotype and the monotype systems, also accelerated the process of composition. And as a result of this combination of machine-made paper, high-speed presses, publishers' bindings, and composing machines, all of the basic elements of the printing process could be mechanized, which decreased printing costs and really produced an explosion of print material. So in the UK, for example, book production rose to 5,000 titles by 1850 and then 10,000 titles by 1910. In the States, the numbers were around 4,500 by 1890, and then 12,000 books per year by 1914. And this increase was even more dramatic in Germany, where it rose from 10,000 titles per year by 1850 to over 35,000 titles per year by 1913. And it's important to add that the expansion of the book market was also due to numerous social changes, including an increase in urban migration, literacy rates, disposable incomes, and leisure time, which also helped to fuel the demand for print material across Europe and all around the world. Now, as printing costs decreased and the demand for print material increased, books also became cheaper than ever before. So in the 1820s, for example, the first edition of a novel in the UK would normally consist of 3 volumes. This was known as a 3-decker or a triple-decker, which was usually priced at around 31.5 shillings. By the 1830s, single volume reprint editions were priced at 5 or 6 shillings. And in 1848, George Routledge also began selling smaller editions known as yellowbacks for 1 or 2 shillings. These were part of what was known as the railway library, books that were designed to be read on the train. In 1885, Cassell tried to compete with their National Library, which consisted of volumes priced at 3 pence in paper and 6 pence in cloth. 6 pence is about half a shilling. And Routledge responded with his World Library, which used the same pricing scheme. So essentially, by the end of the 19th century, British publishers were in a pricing war. French publishers also were producing single volume editions at reduced prices by the 1830s. By 1855, Michel Lévy was publishing novels priced at 1 franc. And by the early 20th century, French readers could buy novels for only 10 centimes. In Germany, Reclam's Universal Library also started a series of small format books priced at only 20 Pfennig, beginning in 1867. And similar price reductions appeared in North America with the rise of dime novels and later half-dime novels like the ones pictured here. And in Italy, there's also the 1 lira novel. In Spain, you have 1 peseta novels. So the expansion of the book market through cheap editions was really an international phenomenon. And the introduction of new publishing formats was accompanied by the introduction of new content like romance, detective, and adventure fiction. And the market for genre fiction expanded even further in the 20th century because lower profit margins forced publishers to accelerate the move towards low-priced books that would appeal to lower-class readers. And this trend was largely due to the rise of paperbacks. In 1928, for example, the German publisher Ullstein produced the Yellow series of crime novels, which sold remarkably well. In 1931, another German publisher, Albatross Books, developed the mass market paperback format, known as the Continental Library, which featured a brand logo and color-coded covers for different genres. So the red cover here indicates that this is a crime novel. And this format was adopted by Penguin Books, which was founded in 1935 with the explicit aim of making books available for a low price. The first Penguin paperbacks were about 6 pence, which is half a shilling, I think, which was roughly the price of a pack of cigarettes. And they also used a similar color coding system. So in this case, this book was blue because it's a biography. And by 1936, Penguin had sold more than 3 million books. And in 1937, they introduced the Penguin Cubator, which was a paperback vending machine, which was stationed mostly it was mostly set up in railway stations or in department stores. And the first American paperback publishers followed the exact same format, and they also introduced similar vending machines. Now, the rise of popular genre fiction and the mass production of these cheap paperbacks soon inspired fears of cultural decline. And I think these fears were most clearly expressed by Reverend Noah Porter, who's the president of Yale, who wrote this book titled Books and Reading, which argued that the industrialization of printing had resulted in a tremendous increase in the number of bad books being published, and that these books would inevitably lead to a decline in cultural standards because they made it more difficult for readers to appreciate good books. Another British literary critic, Queenie Leavis, also argued in her book Fiction and Reading Public that the widespread distribution of popular genre fiction posed a direct threat to serious literature. She said, when railway libraries and yellowbacks offered a kind of reading that needed little exertion, it was not likely that any other type of book would stand a chance. So critics argued that this cultural decline was a result of the increased availability of cheap books, and the superior quality of serious literature was attributed largely to the material properties of the books themselves. It was believed that good books should appeal to an exclusive readership through small print runs, limited distribution, and higher prices. Now, Pierre Bourdieu, the famous French sociologist, tried to explain these persistent fears of cultural decline by describing how serious literature and popular fiction were gradually seen as two competing modes of production, which obeyed inverse logics. And I'll just read this passage here. So at one pole, there is the anti-economic economy of pure art, founded on the obligatory recognition of the values of disinterestedness and of the denegation of the economy or of the commercial and of economic profit. It privileges production oriented to the accumulation of symbolic capital. Now, at the other pole, there is the economic logic of the literary industries, which confer priority on distribution, on immediate and temporary success, measured, for example, by the print run, and which are content to adjust themselves to the pre-existing demand of a clientele. So an enterprise moves closer to the commercial pole, the more directly or completely the products it offers on the market respond to a pre-existing demand in a pre-established form. So he was arguing that publishers basically saw popular fiction as nothing more than a commodity that could be standardized and mass-produced to meet demand, which would then maximize profits. But critics saw serious literature as a higher form of cultural expression that would accumulate cultural value by rejecting all of these commercial imperatives. And this opposition helps to explain why works of popular fiction and serious literature were often promoted in very different ways, because books that were heavily promoted would often be perceived as more popular, which would prevent them from accumulating symbolic capital, whereas books that received no promotion would often be seen as more prestigious, more elite, which would, of course, then limit their marketability. But unlike Leavis, Bourdieu argued that popular fiction didn't really pose a threat to serious literature because serious literature could only accumulate this symbolic capital by differentiating itself from popular fiction. That these two things existed in some way, they needed each other in order to reinforce their own taste distinctions. Now, it's also a problem that the accumulation of symbolic capital could serve economic interests as well, because many publishers tried to enhance the symbolic value of books through the production of deluxe editions. And this can be seen already at the end of the 18th century. Cotta published the collected works of the poet Christoph Wieland in 4 formats, which offered an enormous range of options for the acquisition of exactly the same text. And in 1854, George Putnam also offered an edition of Washington Irving's collected works in 7 different bindings. There was cloth, sheep, half calf, half Morocco, gilt tops. There was calf extra. I'm not sure what that means. There was calf antique, and then Morocco super extra, which was the fanciest type of cover. So this is a price range of $19 to $48, depending on the type of cover the reader would choose. So the appearance of a book mattered as much, if not more, than its content. And many readers sought to enhance the symbolic capital of their literary collections through the addition of these luxurious and high-priced covers. And the market for deluxe books really expanded in the 20th century, particularly in North America. And these editions were designed to look expensive and to appear as if they were rare, which helped to enhance their symbolic value. But they were often mass-produced in very large print runs. Andrew Nash also notes that some trade publishers in the UK, like Chatto and Windus, produced deluxe editions of very unremarkable books in order to break even, and in some cases to profit on books that were likely to make a loss if published in the ordinary way. If you have a book that will only appeal to a small number of readers, it might be more profitable to actually produce it in a deluxe version so that they would have to pay more for it. And Jim Collins also argues that the distinction between economic and symbolic capital has become even more blurred today because, quote, the delivery systems for literary experiences become increasingly large scale, but the mechanisms of taste distinction appear to grow ever more intimate as reading taste becomes more personalized. Now, this emphasis on the appearance of books also reflects this idea of literary texts as commodities, regardless of their cultural status. Janice Radway points this out. The book was conceived of as a permanent and precious possession, and since its intrinsic value was understood to increase with age, it required a design that would promote longevity. The symbolic value of a book also enhanced the cultural status of its owner. She says it could produce perceived changes in the status of the individual who bought it because the more traditional discourse about the book had managed to associate the social prestige of learning with the particular technology for producing that learning. So instead of reading the book, somehow owning the book would convey the same idea that you were a learned person. Mary Benton used this term bookaflage instead of camouflage to describe this practice of purchasing and exhibiting certain editions for the purpose of constructing a cultural persona. So deluxe editions served as markers of socioeconomic status, regardless of whether or not they were actually read, because their symbolic value was embodied in their material form. And their appearance also served as an implicit rejection of the commercial imperatives of the publishing industry, or the idea of mass-produced books as disposable commodities, even though many of these editions were also produced in very large print runs for the purpose of maximizing profits. So the material properties of literary texts have a tremendous influence on their cultural status, which became particularly evident following the expansion of the literary marketplace since the Industrial Revolution. And while these material properties are certainly not all there is to know about a given publication, they are often all one needs to, they're often all that one needs in order to evaluate a book's social importance and significance as an object on the market, because levels of prestige are directly related to publishing decisions concerning things like paper, typography, binding, and of course, the covers. I think this is the second part of the quotation I read before, but I think that's the end of the first part of the presentation.
Yes, thank you so much, Anthony. And remember, we will have the possibility to discuss and to ask questions later. Keep your comments and questions in mind. We now come to the second part, which is part of an overview of the two books Anthony and I did edit together. So in 2015, we've been able to edit a special issue of Belphegor, an electronic journal dedicated to popular culture and media studies, but with a multilingual approach. Therefore, the title is French, Belphegor with accent aigu, subtitle Literature populaire, culture médiatique, including the possibility to publish articles in English, Spanish, French, Italian, or German, which was exactly what we wanted for this special issue named Distinctions That Matter, Popular Literature and Material Culture. We also like the idea of publishing an open access electronic journal, which can be freely read from all over the world until today, so you could enter it right now. The next slide, please. The publication had a wide historic perspective on the topic, starting with, say, an article by the French studies scholar Jennifer Zinn on Diderot's battle against books. And if you're interested in French Enlightenment and book studies, exactly the period when bibliophily and also bibliopathology, bibliotaphie, or other pathological forms of book possession became more and more common, I also recommend you reading her book, The Bad Tastes of Others, Judging Literary Value in 18th Century France, which was inspiring also for our approach. Then in her article written for Belphegor, examines the book debates that immediately preceded the quantitative reading revolution of the 19th century. This also challenges the popular assumptions that Enlightenment thinkers had always advocated education for all, and that they believed education necessarily required literacy and access to books. Diderot and his fellow philosophers did not set out to democratize knowledge. Instead, the rise of literacy alarmed them. They denounced both the quantity of books in circulation and the people's enthusiasm for them. Diderot described ways of reading and collecting books that depended on a distinction between the savants, such as himself, and ordinary readers. In his view, only a few people deserve to have books, and only a few books deserve to be printed. The essential distinction that Diderot makes is between, on the one hand, books as objects that people want to possess for their monetary value or their cultural prestige, and, on the other hand, books as useful objects or tools that allow experts to produce more books. Ultimately, he champions the later use of books and even declares them to be disposable once they have served their purpose, a shocking idea that was ultimately put to the test during the French Revolution. But we have also contributions on the Memoirs of an Arabian Princess by Kate Roy, there for the 19th century, and surrealist artist Marxian's artistic work with the illustrations of the feuilleton novel Roman Feuilleton in his artist's book Une semaine de bonté by Philipp Wenghaus. Roy examines the publication history of the German and English language editions of Emily Rüth's Memoirs of an Arabian Princess. She argues that these editions often reflect a tension between the internal or textual elements of the text which was a serious work of autobiographical non-fiction that sought to introduce Muslim and East African culture to Western readers, and the external or material elements of its various instantiations, which were often marketed as popular works of erotic harem fiction that reinforced the exoticization of Eastern culture. While early editions emphasized the text as one of the first autobiographies ever written by an Arab woman, late editions sought to capitalize on the exotic appeal of Arab women, including also a recent Kindle edition published under the title Dangerous Romance that includes various pornographic images. The packaging of this book has been shaped by genre expectations, even though the content of the text tells a completely different story. And this interaction between material and textual elements reflects a tension between the publisher's desire to satisfy readers' expectations and the writer's desire to defy cultural stereotypes, a tension that can still be seen in contemporary novels about a writer and her life until today. Philipp Wenghaus, in the chapter on Max Ernst's Une semaine de bonté, examines the significance of the source materials, the materials used to produce one of the earliest collage novels ever. Wenghaus argues that the collages created for this book primarily consisted of illustrations from 19th century serialized novels, which mostly featured crime and suspense stories that offered the possibility for exciting visuals that would attract readers. These novels were often condemned by critics as a sign of cultural decline and a reflection of the low taste of the reading public, although many of them were later recognized as literary classics. And in Italy, you have the admiration Umberto Eco is having for this entire 19th century feuilleton novel example given. While this publishing format had already fallen out of fashion in the early 20th century when Ernst created his collage novel, Wenghaus argues that his readers would have still recognized the style of these illustrations and that they would have seen them as a reflection of the society in which they were produced and consumed. Ernst's collage novel thus takes the material form of the serialized novel and turns it into a new material form, the artist's book, that represents a merging of low and high art, low and high taste. But our special issue of Belfico goes also deeply into post-American culture, including a research by Anthony on the poet of pulps, Ray Bradbury, and his struggle for prestige in science fiction. The rise of digest magazines and paperback novels transformed the cultural status also of science fiction in the US in the mid-20th century, as the genre began to appeal to a wider readership and was reviewed in mainstream literary publications. The notion of science fiction as a legitimate literary genre was thus inherently linked to the emergence of new material forms, which appealed to a broader range of taste cultures. In order to examine this cultural shift, Anthony focused specifically on the publication history of Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451. It illustrates the cultural transformation of science fiction, not only because it was one of the first magazine stories expanded and republished as a novel in 1953, but also because it was one of the first science fiction novels to achieve significant recognition among mainstream literary critics. The desire for cultural legitimacy is also mirrored within the narrative itself, as it illustrates the perceived threat mass culture posed to the literary establishment, which has encouraged some critics to interpret the novel as an attempt to preserve the power of the literary elite and of the book. But Bradbury was simultaneously involved in the production of many different forms of mass culture, including comic books, films, radio, television. And Goris wrote a contribution on the materiality of the category romance novel, and therefore on another very popular and normally neglected genre of literature, neglected by serious scholars who have a strict canon and closed notion of literature instead of, say, a more open one that covers literature beyond. Goris examines the significance of popular publishing formats by analyzing the material properties of category romance novels. While the romance genre represents perhaps the most iconic example of lowbrow fiction, and the material properties of these novels often encourage simplistic and superficial interpretations, she describes them as a complex science system that generates a multitude of meanings to readers familiar with the cultural codes, and also argues that these features serve as brand markers that signify distinctions readers familiar with the genre can easily understand. While the physical similarities between romance novels had often been ridiculed as a reflection of their inherently formulaic and standardized content, she argues that the generic transparency of these novels is the result of a material strategy that publishers have successfully used to maximize profits, and that the material properties of these books actually reflect a tremendous wealth of variation, which experienced readers have learned to identify. And then, of course, the comic and the comic book and the graphic novel and their special national peculiarities. Sylvain Lesage wrote on the situation in Belgium and France, Giovanni Remonato on the situation in Italy, covering Corto Maltese. In Mutation des Supports, Mutation des Publics, Lesage focuses on the history of comic strips and graphic novels in France and Belgium. He begins, of course, with the culture and editorial changes that made the bande dessinée central to contemporary French culture. The crucial point for this re-evaluation was the change from comics in high print runs in cheap comic journals to lower print runs in more expensive books in the album format, which unified a previously published series into a book-like volume. Lesage also examines how lending rates and book sales have encouraged more and more highbrow publishers in recent years to publish work in this formerly shady and sometimes shabby genre. This change has been made possible through the transfer of the sacral features of the book into the vulgar realm of the comic strip. The importance of the bookish features of bande dessinée can also be seen in the biases of comic festivals, the purchasing politics of libraries and museums, which have also contributed to the new cultural legitimacy of comic strips and graphic novels. This cultural legitimacy has not only been economically successful, but it has also led to the establishment of the ninth art. In the field of art history, as many of the creators of comic strips have been elevated to the status of artists nowadays, through a change in the material properties of text, a formerly detested popular genre consisting of violence, of sex, of crime, had thus become part of the highbrow culture. You all might know Corto Maltese, and Giovanni Remonato wrote on Corto Maltese tra fumetto e letteratura disegnata, the Hugo Pratt Corto Maltese comics. At the time of its first appearance in 1967, this series was published in comic magazines for children, such as Il Corriere dei Piccoli in Italy, Pif Gadget in France. It then moved to a new type of adult-oriented magazine with more intellectual ambition, such as Linus. But in 1973, it was republished in book form by Mondadori, and in 1995 it was even transformed into a novel. By examining various editions of the text, Remonato thus traces the rise of this series from children's fiction to highbrow culture. This includes the ambitions of its creator, as Pratt aims to create letteratura disegnata, while at the same time being an advocate and consumer of the popular arts and refusing to be called an artist. The cultural prestige that Corto Maltese has achieved is also confirmed by other material instantiations of the series outside the realm of comics, including film adaptations, museum exhibitions, as well as translations into different languages. This realm of how taste is negotiated by authors, editors, translators, but also material aspects of the book is likely nowhere so clearly to be seen as in a transformation from the pulp comic to the comic book and the graphic novel, and will therefore be covered by Anthony in his case study he will present later, so keep this in mind. But there was also a possibility for a very British way of dealing with the comic genre. Jeff Toss treats it by investigating the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where he examines how artists have commented on the history of popular culture by incorporating and transforming older publishing formats. In this case, he focuses on a contemporary book series that borrows characters from 19th century texts that was designed to imitate the form of 19th century publications, illustrated newspapers, penny dreadfuls, boys' weeklies, which helped to pave the way for the emergence of the comic book form. And the horror and the thrill, you might ask, isn't Belphegor normally about lowbrow literature closest to bad taste and worst trash? Well, we have not only an article in this collection on the King of Pulps, but also one on the King of Horror. Thorsten Bothe writes on Stephen King's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon and its German translation Das Mädchen, and the ways of gaining social prestige only regarding the way the dust jacket was designed. Because the problem with judging books by its cover remains central for dealing with them in the market and as material objects which are produced, displayed, bought and read. He analyzed the material properties of a horror novel that was published with two different dust jackets. He argues that readers choosing between these jackets are essentially choosing between two different books, and that their purchasing decision reflects their expectations or interpretations of the novel itself, such as whether the ending will be happy or sad. So like Goris, Bothe argues that this decision is informed by their knowledge of genre conventions as well as their own distinctions of taste. In other words, these jacket variants serve the same function as deluxe editions by implying scarcity and exclusivity, and the purchasing of one or both versions allows readers familiar with the genre to display their taste preferences to other readers within their interpretive community. This collection of very readable articles is still on the net and can be accessed by you right now. It gives a framework for the shared interests by Anthony and me, but also by a range of other scholars interested in literature and its beyond, especially given material culture. But since books have their materiality and the topic is vast, Anthony and I thought it would not only be necessary to also organize a conference on the topic of distinctions in material culture, but also to have something more real and materially more solid in hands than an electronic journal. So we finally decided to make a printed book out of it, which cannot be accessed right now, but will be published in July, finally. Consumerism and Prestige, the Materiality of Literature in the Modern Age, with Anthem Press, a London and New York-based publisher known for academic books with a certain twist. I will also give a very short overview on the table of contents before we go deeper into the examples presented by Anthony. And remember, this is an open field, and we are happy to discuss with you later what we had to leave out or which we are missing simply due to our lack of knowledge or experience. The second publication, also the first printed book, contains 4 sections and starts again in the early 19th century with German Romanticism. Christoph Raun writes about Ludwig Tieck, literary pocketbooks, and the novella craze. While pocketbooks democratized literature by making texts more accessible and affordable, they were also perceived as a threat to prestige of literature as they were mass-produced in serial form. Some of the most highly esteemed writers refused to be published in them. Raun describes how publishers tried to sustain the cultural authority of serious literature through the use of material strategies, like using leather covers, gold rims, and silk lining. Tieck's works often addressed the material properties of books as well as their economic and social status. The material properties of Tieck's works reflect these conflicting tensions between art and commerce in the early 19th century. And we stay in the realm of German literature, going to Austrian Nobel Prize winner Peter Handke. Jakob Haupenreich writes on the distinguished ways Handke developed taking decisions concerning graphic aspects in his books, especially the dust jackets. The material properties of Handke's books announced their social status as works of serious literature by replicating the form and style of handmade books and by including facsimiles of the author's own handwritten manuscript. Haupenreich argues that these features serve to defamiliarize the mass-produced book by evoking the erratic quality of art. In contrast to works of popular genre fiction designed to be read quickly and then discarded, Handke's books were intended to be read slowly, which is part of his project to resacralize the act of writing and of reading. Haupenreich shows how Handke used the materiality of literature to reinforce traditional distinctions of taste and to challenge the idea of the novel as a mass-produced commodity. Finally, a big step over the ocean, the Brazilian book market at the beginning of the 21st century. Here, Laura Gagliardi examines the emergence of deluxe books publishers in contemporary Brazil, Companhia das Letras and Kojak Naive. I will leave this out and come to the second section, which is named Material Distinctions in Popular Fiction. It contains, again, the 3 articles by Kate Roy and Goris and Thorsten Bothe I already introduced you to, but you might realize that the essay of Bothe is now in English instead of a huge variety of publication languages. As in the Belfigo issue, the Anthem Press publication is in English only. And section 3 is named Cultural Prestige and Graphic Narratives. It is the heart of what Anthony will explain to you later and contains his contribution. He will shortly introduce you on his own, comic books versus graphic novels, but also the 2 articles from Belfigo written by Philip Wenghaus and Jeff Toss. The section focuses on how the material properties of visual text reflect or shape their cultural status. Finally, section 4 is dedicated to electronic publishing and reading practices, also the ebook, starting with my thoughts on the book and the ebook versions of Junot Diaz, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, but also containing Laura Hedry's article on ebook collections as an opportunity to recover unpublished or forgotten texts. This section concludes the volume by examining how new forms of electronic displays are currently transforming the status of literary texts. The Brief Wanderer's Life of Oscar Wilde was differently converted from a print book to an ebook, but the epigraphs and footnotes in the original novel stage a tension between low and high culture, as the novel includes numerous references to popular culture, including science fiction, fantasy, and of course comic books. Yet these references are offset by the narrator's editorial annotations, which provide a more serious commentary on the narrative's historical, political, and social context. The book's status as one of the preeminent novels of the early 21st century was thus largely dependent on the interplay between the main text and the note text, but the notes were either omitted or relegated to a different section in all of the available ebook versions. As a result, the main text and the note text cannot be read in concert with one another, and all of the typographic features that visually indicate the relationship have been lost, such as the positioning of the text on the page or the use of different sized fonts. So the cultural prestige of this novel was largely dependent on the material properties of the print editions, which could not be transferred to the ebook editions. It is difficult, if not impossible, to replicate the qualities of bookishness using current electronic formats, I would say. But there's of course a different perspective on this topic. Instead of focusing on the problems that arise when converting print books to ebooks, Laura Hatch's chapter Ebook Collections as an Opportunity to Recover Unpublished or Forgotten Texts focuses on the advantages of publishing literary texts in electronic formats. She primarily argues that electronic publishing enables the recovery of literary texts that have gone out of print due to a lack of commercial interest. Given that the cost of producing ebook editions is lower than the cost of producing print editions, editors now have the unique ability to choose texts based on their cultural rather than commercial value. An example of this new approach is Clásicos Hispánicos, an ebook series created by a scholar from Madrid who realized that there were no serious digital editions of classical works of Hispanic literature. As a result of this project, it became possible to recover material that had been forgotten for cultural, political, or also economic reasons. Another important aspect is that these editions are in the care of recognized academics who annotate the text with footnotes that explain their historical and literary significance. So unlike me, arguing that literary prestige is dependent on the qualities of bookishness associated with printed books, Laura Hatry concludes that ebooks are potentially more prestigious than print books because they are less dependent on the economic imperatives of the publishing industry. She also argues that innovative editorial projects like Clásicos Hispánicos challenge the stigma that ebook editions are of poor quality and display a lack of scholarly rigor, as they show that ebooks also offer advantages for scholars and readers interested in serious literature by reducing the gap between upper-class readers who can afford to buy expensive out-of-print editions and lower-class readers who no longer have to pay such exorbitant prices. And finally, the last chapter of this Anton Press book is also on the margins of literature and beyond literature. It is an experimental work by two Italian scholars working on reading from a psychological perspective, Pascalina Sorrentino and Massimo Salgado. They ask how much does the symbolic capital of books cost and show how the prestige of books in a digital age can be measured and operationalized in various experimental settings. While many disagree concerning the cultural status of electronic texts, they outline how the material influences the perception of literary prestige. Like many of the contributors to our volume, they describe the prestige of literature as the product of a tension between symbolic and economic capital, as works that are heavily promoted, mass-produced, and commercially successful are often perceived as less serious and therefore less prestigious. Their study attempted to determine whether the material form of a literary text, as a print book or an ebook, was also seen as an indicator of its quality, appeal, or target audience. Based on the results of their empiric study, Sorrentino and Salgado argue that print books are still more deeply invested with symbolic capital than ebooks, as they are perceived as more serious, rare, and expensive. They conclude that distinctions of taste are largely depending on the material properties of literary texts and that print books continue to serve a crucial non-literary function as markers of cultural status. So you see, this is a vast interdisciplinary field and there's still plenty of research to do. But before we start our discussion, Anthony will shortly introduce you to at least one case study more intensively. He will show the relationship between the material forms and cultural prestige, of graphic narratives by looking more closely at the history of the graphic novel.
Bernhard, thank you so much for that presentation. Do you think we have time for the case study, or should we maybe go straight to discussion now?
I overstretched for at least 10 minutes. You're right. So if we would like to stick to the time schedule, to the official one, we should come now to the discussion, which is true. So we have another 35 minutes or 37 minutes.
Valentina, what do you think?
I believe that we can ask if anyone has any questions.
Right, which is a
and
good
and then if anyone hasn't, we can
okay, that
continue.
makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyone can appear or want to write in the chat of the platform. It seems that
maybe I should just continue.
Okay, maybe there is also the problem of the language, and a lot of person has. Okay, so we can continue, and then if anyone want to write, he's welcome.
But you could write also in Italian, and we try to
also in Italian, and we will translate it.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Bernhard. So yes, as he explained, my previous work was on the history of science fiction publishing. And I was really focused on American science fiction and how it was originally popularized through these pulp magazines. And they were referred to as pulps. That was a reference to the type of cheap paper that was used to produce them. And these magazines were distributed through newsstands and drugstores. And their inferior quality really reflected their low cultural status. It encouraged readers to perceive of these magazines as trivial and inconsequential. But science fiction gradually expanded into the literary market, as Bernhard mentioned, through the rise of these digest magazines, which looked more like small paperback books, and then of course the book market. Pulp science fiction was first reprinted in these paperback book forms in the 1950s by publishers like Hillman and Avon. And then Doubleday also started to produce hardcover editions of pulp science fiction, which transformed the public perception of the genre by connoting a higher level of cultural prestige. Not only could these books be sold in regular bookstores, but they were also reviewed in literary journals, something that would have been inconceivable for a pulp magazine. So in my more recent work, I'm looking at how a sort of similar process involving comic books and their transformation, the transformation of their cultural prestige through the rise of the new graphic novel. And I argue that the graphic novels enhance the cultural prestige of comics by introducing, again, new methods of production and promotion and distribution. For example, the fears of cultural decline associated with comic books were directly attributed to their inferior material qualities, which made them appear to be nothing more than standardized, mass-produced, and disposable commodities. But graphic novels were differentiated from comic books through their paper, their printing, and their binding, which made them appear to be durable works of literature that were worthy of being sold in bookstores, collected in libraries, and reviewed in literary journals. In other words, the graphic novel allowed publishers to evade the social stigma associated with comic books by appealing to readers, librarians, and critics who would not normally be interested in comics. And the graphic novel format can be understood really as a publishing and marketing strategy that served to elevate the status of comics. And this work of cultural recuperation was only possible because of its material form. That's my argument. So comic books initially adopted the exact same production and distribution methods as that were used in the pulp magazine industry. They were sold mainly through newsstands and drugstores. They used the same paper, the same printing and binding techniques, which again reinforced the perception of comics as trivial and inconsequential. And critics also claim that the dangers posed by comic books were directly attributed to their mode of production. So this begins already in 1940. There was a literary critic in Chicago, Sterling North, who argued that comic books placed a strain on young eyes and young nervous systems because they were badly drawn, badly written, and badly printed. The printing was actually quite important. One of the most vocal opponents of comic books was the psychiatrist Frederick Wertham, who also argued that comic books were a leading cause of reading disorders due to their inferior qualities. Print is easy to read when the paper background is light and the printing a good contrasting black, yet most comics are smudgily printed on pulp paper. The printing is crowded in balloons with irregular lines. We can produce the most beautifully printed books, yet to our children, we give the crudest and most ill-designed products. So like North, Wertham was he concluded that the material form of the comic book was physically unhealthy. And of course, the only cure was to read a beautifully printed book. Librarians expressed very similar concerns. I won't go, maybe I will just skip over this part, but basically librarians were horrified by the popularity of comic books, and they tended to point to their inferior physical qualities, their material properties, when arguing why young children should not be reading them. Now, these arguments produced a stigma that was directly associated with the material form of the comic book, and the only way for publishers and artists to resist this stigma was by developing a new publishing format, namely the graphic novel, which begins in the 1970s. So Black Mark, which was published in 1971, was written by Gil Kane. It's a 120-page mass market paperback that contained a full-length adventure story, and the writing was typeset rather than hand-lettered, and the layouts were extremely irregular. There was no strict sort of grid that you would normally see in a comic book, which was an attempt to evoke the traditions of illustrated novels. In 1976, this term graphic novel was used to describe Jim Steranko's book Chandler, which was a digest-sized paperback, and George Metzger's Beyond Time and Again, which was a hardcover, about I think a 50-page hardcover edition that was described as a graphic novel on its title page, and Richard Corbin's Blood Star, a book that was simultaneously published in hardcover and softcover editions, and that used the term graphic novel on its dust jacket. And I should also mention, Blood Star was originally serialized in a color version. So he originally did it in color, but for the book version, he shifted back to black and white, which was partly, I think, he was trying to distance the work from comic books, but it could have also been about reducing printing costs. Now, the introduction to Chandler described that book as a singular blend of words and pictures that was much more than a comic book. And the introduction of Blood Star said it combines all the imagination and visual power of comics with the richness of a traditional novel. So essentially, these books were attempting to enhance the cultural status of the content by presenting the work as an illustrated novel rather than a comic book. Now, 3 more graphic novels appeared in '78. There was The First Kingdom, which was a reprint of several editions of the comic book series of the same name. There was Saber, which was a relatively conventional science fiction narrative. And then there was A Contract with God by Will Eisner. This was a 200-page book that was published simultaneously in softcover and hardcover editions that used the term graphic novel on its cover. So Eisner's book was very different from these other works that came out at the same time because it was not a work of genre fiction. It focused on working class Jewish life in New York during the Great Depression, and Eisner described it as a departure from the standard comic book, not only in terms of its content, but in terms of its appearance. He said, I tried to do a book that would physically look like a legitimate book. So historians often recognize A Contract with God as the first official graphic novel, but I think it's really important to note that it was neither the first work to be marketed as a graphic novel, nor the first work that attempted to use this publishing category to elevate its cultural status. It was actually part of a huge movement. And comic book publishers immediately began to publish graphic novels as well. In the late 70s, Simon & Schuster published a series of books that contained reprinted material from Marvel Comics. And in '78, they published Stanley and Jack Kirby's The Silver Surfer, which featured an original book-length story written specifically as a graphic novel. So this is not a story that is reprinted from a comic book, like many other graphic novels up to this point. But I think you can see in the image to the right that it really looks no different from a comic book. Certainly the narrative was borrowed directly from a narrative that they'd already written for the Fantastic Four. In 1982, Marvel also introduced a series of oversized trade paperbacks featuring original superhero narratives, and DC created its own graphic novel line the following year. So while these graphic novels contained the same kind of content that was featured in comic books, they were published on glossy paper, they didn't have any fan letters or internal advertising, and they had much higher cover prices. So the prices for these graphic novels was around $6 or $7 compared to 40 cents, which was the price of a comic book at the time. So by the early 80s, the market was already saturated with the graphic novels featuring these kinds of superhero narratives, which were sold in specialty comic book shops and marketed to comic book collectors who were willing to pay higher prices for higher quality publications. And the rise of the graphic novel is really part of the shift to what's known as direct market sales, where instead of working through distributors, publishers were selling works directly to retailers. The first major change in this strategy was Frank Miller's Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. This was a 4-issue limited series comic book published by DC in what it called its prestige format, which included square binding, glossy paper, and cardstock covers. Despite the fact that each issue cost $2.95, which was a really high price at the time, the comic book sold remarkably well. It went through several printings before it was then collected as a graphic novel later the same year. And 3 editions of the graphic novel were also released simultaneously. So Warner published softcover and hardcover editions, and then Graffiti Designs published a limited oversized hardcover edition, pictured here on the right, that included additional pages of sketches and artwork. So while the limited series and the limited hardcover edition were aimed at comic book collectors, Warner's editions were sold in mainstream bookstores, and they were marketed to a broader readership. And the softcover edition was even featured as a selection at the Quality Paperback Book Club, which was a mail order paperback service. It was one of the only graphic novels included in the Quality Paperback Book Club. And William Aricchio and Roberta Pearson point out that this strategy gave the comic book industry an unaccustomed measure of respectability, and it was so successful that this went on to be one of the most profitable graphic novels ever produced. And newspapers and magazines helped to promote these graphic novels by proclaiming that comic books were now appropriate for adult readers. The St. Petersburg Times said that Batman: The Dark Knight Returns was as far away from standard Pow Biff sock comics as Masterpiece Theater is from Gilligan's Island. Newsday emphasized that it looks very little like a comic book due to its length, its cover price, and the fact that it's lushly printed and bound on heavy stock. So reviewers were really emphasizing the importance of the material form of this book. And Miller himself said, "I wanted to do something you wouldn't be ashamed to take on an airplane with you," because the material form demanded more serious attention. It forced people to take it more seriously. So what had changed was not the content of the works, but rather their modes of production and distribution, which helped to elevate their cultural status. And it's also strange that reviewers frequently compared this particular graphic novel with Art Spiegelman's, I'm going to skip that slide, with Art Spiegelman's Mouse, a graphic novel that came out the same year. So these two works really have nothing in common at the level of content. So The Dark Knight Returns is about a middle-aged Batman who returns from retirement to defeat his arch enemies, whereas Mouse is a non-fictional account of the experiences of the artist's parents during the Holocaust. And these two artists had totally different backgrounds. So Frank Miller had worked for many years in the mainstream comic book industry, while Spiegelman was a huge figure in the underground and avant-garde comics movement. But their graphic novels were frequently compared because they employed the same publishing and marketing strategies. And Mouse was also featured as a selection in the Quality Paperback Book Club. So they would have been shown side by side in advertisements. So the LA Times noted that these graphic novels had together provoked the first aesthetically serious discussions of the comic book as an art form in America. The New York Times claimed that Spiegelman's goal is to expand the very notion of what a comic strip can do, to make intelligent readers reconsider and reject the widespread notion of comics as kid culture. And the Chicago Tribune argued that these graphic novels could awaken the most people to the format's potential because they are stretching traditional genre boundaries. So the comparisons between these graphic novels show how their cultural status was really dependent on their material forms. As the format seemed to imply a cultural distinction, that couldn't really be sustained at the level of content. And these comparisons were also based on their commercial success, as graphic novels could only be seen as elevating the cultural status of comics because they were distributed outside of specialty comic book shops, which shows once again how the circulation of cultural capital can never be entirely removed from the circulation of economic capital. And the entry of graphic novels into the trade book market was soon followed by their entry into libraries. So while librarians had been the most vocal opponents of comic books in the 40s, they gradually became huge proponents of graphic novels as a format that was capable of enticing young people to read books again. So Michael Lavin notes that the main concerns of librarians were that the physical format of comic books is too fragile. Comics won't stand up to heavy use. They're too difficult to acquire and catalog. But the graphic novels seemed to solve these problems, which made their acquisition socially acceptable. And this shift began, I would say, around 1988, when an article in the Voice of Youth Advocates asserted that graphic novels fit the standard definition of books and that they should be something for libraries to consider. In 1990, Library Journal also began to feature a series of articles that described which graphic novels were most appropriate for libraries. And in the mid-90s, there were two different bibliographies. Rothschild's graphic novels, which came out in 95, and Steve Viner's 100 graphic novels for public libraries, which also provided key resources for librarians who were trying to develop graphic novel collections. So Alan Ellis and Doug Highsmith conclude that the rise of the graphic novel was the single most important change insofar as enhancing the status of comic books as appropriate for inclusion in library collections by making them appear to be more like real books. Amy Nyberg also notes that this shift was a result of the attention paid to graphic novels at academic conferences, which also were trying to legitimize these texts and promote their cultural significance. So one of the first academic conferences devoted to graphic narratives was titled The Graphic Novel. It was held at the University of Massachusetts in 1998. Comic studies has since become an established discipline that supports at least 4 annual conferences in the United States alone. And these conferences have fueled the production of scholarship in this field, which also led to the creation of several academic journals and they've also encouraged educators to explore the use of graphic novels in the classroom. And there are 2 recent anthologies about this very topic. The one on the left, Building Literacy Connections with Graphic Novels, was published by the National Council of Teachers of English, and the one on the right, Teaching the Graphic Novel, was published by the Modern Language Association. So these are extremely reputable collections. So the graphic novel enhanced the cultural prestige of graphic narratives at the cost of reinforcing the stigma associated with comic books, which was somewhat paradoxical because most graphic novels didn't really possess the kind of literary value that artists, publishers, librarians, and educators really associated with this term. And their publication did not necessarily represent a rejection of the commercial imperatives of the comic book industry. For example, graphic novels like Batman: The Dark Knight Returns consist of material that was originally serialized in comic books and then collected in book form, which allowed it to be sold in bookstores and collected in libraries and reviewed in literary journals, regardless of the fact that its content did not represent a significant departure from that of mainstream comic books. And the graphic novel format also encouraged reviewers to conflate this work with other graphic novels like Maus, regardless of their obvious differences in content. So the critical reception of these works shows how the function of the graphic novel as a publishing category was assumed by its material form, and its material form was able to supplant genre as a differentiating criterion and thereby establish the legitimacy of graphic narratives precisely because the modes of production and distribution allowed it to escape the stigma associated with the comic book. And while it may seem impossible to reinforce cultural distinctions based solely on a work's material properties, these distinctions often serve a crucial function for publishers who are trying to target different readerships, for librarians who are trying to develop classification systems for their collections, for educators who are trying to maintain cultural standards and traditions, and also for artists who are trying to balance an appreciation for comic books with a desire to transcend the commercial limitations of the comic book industry. So material forms remain important within the realms of commerce and art and academia, precisely because they often have the power to signify distinctions of taste that cannot be sustained at the level of content. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm very impressed because I'm very fascinating because there are a lot of things about the history of a graphic novel, for example, that I don't know. And listening to you, it comes to my mind a phrase of a communication theorist that I remember now, that is Marshall McLuhan, who said that the medium is the message, and I believe to can say that in effect the medium, the material culture, is not more important than the message, but it's an important way to develop the message and to help the prestigious of a genre, for example, the graphic novel genre, that born like a secondary genre, not as the same importance of the big novel. So
yeah, that's a great connection. McLuhan isn't really thinking about the issue of prestige when he said that, right? He's thinking more about the epistemological functions of different media. But I think you're absolutely right that you could see prestige as essentially the message of these material forms. The message that they're conveying is the cultural status of the work.
yes,
yeah,
yes, and it's very impressive. So I don't know if anyone has the questions now. And okay, so let me thank Professor Anthony Enns and Dr. Bernard Metz for your presentation. There is a questions or no?
There is one. I see one.
Yeah.
Kai Rivat. Does prestige increase if book aimed or perceived to be aimed at an adult audience? Relatedly, how big an influence of a book have on its perceived prestige? In relation to case study, where does limited edition collector's market for rare comics fit into the publishing and reading world you have described? So it's about the audience and whether there's an infant or adult audience, and the entire question of what type of editor is publishing something.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say in terms of the history of the graphic novel, that was one of the interesting things I found when going through these old book reviews, is that a number of them felt that the graphic novel was making it acceptable for adults to read this work. Adults who would not feel comfortable buying the comic book version felt perfectly fine buying the graphic novel version. And the idea that the genre had, that the superhero narrative had grown up is of course absurd. Superhero narratives didn't change. This was a narrative that had already been published as a comic book. But the perception is that now it was acceptable for adults to read them precisely because of the shift in the material form, because it was a book. I think, I have not researched this, but I think you can see a similar sort of story in the 19th century with books like, I'm thinking of Treasure Island or King Solomon's Mines. Right? These are books that were initially marketed as books for children, but then they found that a large number of adults were reading them, and they changed the way they packaged and sold these books in order, and got rid of. They also changed the way that they were or the way that they were reporting the book sales. So they introduced new. I think at one point there were bestseller lists, separate bestseller lists for children's books and for adult books. And they actually had to conflate them at one point because they found that adults were overwhelmingly buying King Solomon's Mines, which had been classified as a children's book. So very often the packaging and the promotion and the distribution can really determine who is reading the book, and sometimes they have to change those things in order to address the fact that a certain book is appealing to readerships that they hadn't planned on. I think that's also a really interesting idea. Now, the second part of your question, where does limited edition or collector's market for rare comics fit into the publishing and reading world? I would say there's all the direct market, the creation of limited editions for comic book collectors has never disappeared. So at the same time that you could create these more mainstream graphic novels for a wider readership that would be sold in regular bookstores, they also went for these high-end limited edition collector's items, because the direct market revealed again that there was a huge number of adults who would be willing to pay large amounts of money for comic book material, that there was an untapped market, a market potential through these large oversized special deluxe editions. But these deluxe editions, I'm not sure if they are designed to convey the kind of cultural prestige of the mainstream graphic novel, the one sold in bookstores, because again they're targeted for the comic book reader. They're actually there's a kind of scarcity or rarity that is also tied to comic book culture, even though comic books still have the stigma associated with them, and the comic book the specialty comic book shop would have a very limited readership. It still had its own type of prestige, which was associated with, of course, cover price, and collectors, are often competing with each other to see how large of a collection they can collect, especially if a comic book is rare. So that would be, I would say, maybe a subcultural practice, that you have groups of readers who are within a sort of the comic book fan culture, who have developed their own subcultural form of capital, if that makes sense.
It's a very comprehensive answer. So I believe that.
Well, and what one has to ask whether there is a certain development as well. So we have more complex graphic novels during the last 20 years, I would say. And very often you have what I find interesting, kinds of illustrated great books of world literature, like the illustrated À la recherche du temps perdu, the illustrated Uomo senza qualità di Robert Musil, stuff like that, which has not been there, say, during the 80s, during the 90s. So there is, there's also certain national specialities, I would say. So we mentioned France and Belgium, where the comic the comic book had always a certain standing. At the same time, Spain, which has a certain and very strong comic book tradition, but also Italy, maybe. Somebody like Lorenzo Mattotti, already more than 20 years ago, did publish with Einaudi. And this was always imagined to be art instead of simple entertainment, of simple comic art. And as I was reading, Mattotti also did a graphic novel on Jekyll and Hyde. So there's also this combination of world literature in the comic book, in his case, and I would say in many others. And if you would enter a comic book store today, and I would say there are more than there used to be 10 years ago, and more than there used to be 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, there was one only in Munich, and nowadays you would find 10 of them, or you would find 20 or 30 in Berlin. They're huge, and they have a certain amount of world literature books illustrated as a graphic novel, which could be new, and according to me, something which has not been there 20 years ago.
Okay, so thank you so much. He has an answer, so super interesting, he says. And I believe that we are at the conclusion. So if anyone has a question, I would like to thank Professor Anthony Enns and Bernard Metz for your presentation, and also the audience who followed the discussion. I believe that you have... okay, yes, I believe that you have already made some very comprehensive concluding remarks. So I have nothing to add other than to say that some crucial issues have been raised, and that we are all waiting for the book to be published so that we can read it and perhaps review it. And before saying goodbye, I have to make 3 announcements. Firstly, I link with an anonymous satisfaction questionnaire, which we ask you to fill in because it is very important for planning and organizing future events. So we would be very grateful if you would fill in the form and add your suggestions. Secondly, those who wish to request a certificate of attendance can write an email to events@bembus.org with their full name and optionally date and place of birth. And finally, I would like to remind that the next seminar will be held in Italian on Friday, April 8th. And Andrea Torre, Associate Professor at the Scuola Normale Superiore of Pisa, will give a lecture on literature and painting entitled Letteratura e pittura, forme ed esperienze della cultura verbovisiva rinascimentale. So the discussion will be moderated by Chiara De Cesare, PhD student at the University of Parma. And we have finished, so thank you very much for being with us, and we wish a good day and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Evening.